always like to start off my lecture about submarine warfare in the Pacific with this photograph because it always reminds me why I didn't go into submarines. Pretty crowded. I've never been on a nuclear submarine, although I know people who are in the nuclear navy, but I would imagine it's a lot roomier than this. And I'll go a little bit into the history of submarines, but I'm just going to touch on a few things. Otherwise, my 45 minutes will be up before I even get to World War II. The weapon that was used most effectively in submarines in World War II, and even well before that, even in World War I, was the torpedo. And it was Robert Whitehead, who was an Englishman, and Giovanni Lupus, even though it sounds like an Italian name, I think he was actually from the Austro-Hungarian Empire. But it was as early as 1864 that he invented the first torpedo that was propelled by a compressed engine. So the two of them got together and refined this product, and it was something, I think it was in Rijeka, which was in northern Italy. I'm not sure if Rijeka is still part of Italy or another country right now, but that's where they had their torpedo factory. And it was the Whitehead Vickers that was used by the British and some other countries later in the century and into the next century. And it was a pretty effective torpedo. It was sort of basic compared to some torpedoes that came out much later because it had a simple contact exploder. But as you will see as I get into my lecture, the contact exploder, even as we get into World War II, was probably more effective than some of the fancier ones that they had been working on between the two wars. But like I said, the torpedo came along even before the submarine. So torpedoes, for the most part, were used on ships. They had these small, I wouldn't call that a ship, I guess I would call it a boat, and it had one torpedo tube. And like I said, it was Vickers in England who supplied the torpedoes to actually a lot of European countries, including the United States until 1907, when the United States set up its first torpedo factory in Rhode Island. And actually, they bought a lot of Vickers torpedoes, and it was under Thomas Hart, who later became a four-star admiral, who had two assignments during his naval career at the torpedo factory, and his first assignment was taking the Vickers and trying to improve on it for U.S. Navy use. I might also point out, and I did it in an earlier lecture, when Japan went to war with Russia in 1904 and 1905, one of the weapons that they used quite effectively was the torpedo, when they made a sneak attack on the Russian Asiatic fleet off Port Arthur there in China. Now, surprisingly, the French took a real interest in the submarine early on because they had this vast coastline on the Atlantic, on the English Channel, and even in the Mediterranean. And they were dedicated to defending their frontiers. Now, during the 17th century under Louis XIV, he had a military engineer by the name of Vauban who spent most of his career building fortifications all around the French border in case one of their neighbors decided to go to war with them, whether it was the Italians, the Spanish, or the Germans, or even the English coming across the English Channel. But of course, with the military hardware improving over the years, those forts that he spent so much time and money building really became useless. So the French were saying, well, we have to find another way of defending this vast coastline of ours. So they invested heavily in submarines in the latter part of the 19th and into the 20th century. Surprisingly, though, it was the Germans who first made the most effective use of the submarine. And John Holland, who was an Irish immigrant, is considered the father of the modern-day submarine. Of course, you know, in the Navy in those days, if you came up with some new idea, new weapon, it was kind of a hard sell because you got these guys have been in the Navy for 150 years, and they think the way we've been doing it for the last 150 years is good enough. Why do we need all this new technology? So it was a bit of a sell at first, but anyway, he finally did convince the Navy at least to experiment with submarines. Anyway, this was one of the early Holland submarines. It wasn't very long and only had one torpedo tube, and they used gasoline engines and batteries. Of course, the problem with the gasoline engine is that it gives off a lot of fumes, and if you're submerged and you've got fumes in there and a spark sets it off, well, everybody dies, right? So not a good idea. And if you look at the expression on these early submariners, they probably had the same concern. Commander Harry Caldwell doesn't look very happy about assignment. He may have been punished. They may have assigned him to the submarine as punishment of some sort. His crew looks more like a gang of pirates. The uniform of the day apparently is whatever was kicking around on the floor that day. But this is Admiral Nimitz, and before he became famous for his role in fighting the war in the Pacific during World War II, he started off his career in submarines. And it was the Germans who came up with the idea of getting rid of gasoline engines in submarines and replacing them with diesel, because diesel is less volatile. So Admiral Nimitz, back when he was a lieutenant or whatever, he became known as the Navy's diesel experts in submarines. In World War I, there were approximately at least in 1914, there were approximately 400 subs worldwide. And the U-boats in World War I and again in World War II came very close to bringing England to its knees by basically starving it to death, because those old U-boats were pretty good, considering they really hadn't been used extensively until World War I. But the numbers I come up with was in World War I alone, they sank about 6,000 vessels. Now, I just found that kind of hard to believe, but I met this fellow who has a PhD in marine history from England, and he says, well, you have to consider what they sank. Certainly they sank some warships, they sank a lot of merchant ships, but also what they would do, England was really dependent on its fishing fleets to a certain extent. So you might have a submarine come up in the middle of a British fishing fleet. There might be hundreds of boats out there, and they would sink as many as they could with their deck guns. So I think those are in this 6,000 total that you see up there. And so 6 U-boats sank 1,000 ships in a 3-month period in 1917 alone. And so with a loss ratio of 1 to 32, which is pretty good. But also because of the submarine, and because the U-boats especially almost brought England to its knees, they had to start rethinking things. And they came up with ideas of how to defeat the submarine, because it was a stealthy weapon. If it was submerged, you couldn't see it. They even had things like where they have listening devices in the water, see if they could pick up a sound. And then I think it was a fellow by the name of Rutherford, who was an Englishman, or a New Zealander, who won the Nobel Prize for Physics at one time. He was among those who worked on the idea of sonar. Sonar was like sending out sound waves in the water. When they hit an object, it would bounce back. And once they refined the technique, it was helped them find this stealthy weapon that you couldn't see because it was underwater. They also had to figure out a way of being able to get convoys, or get ships, I should say, from point A to point B, where they might have a chance of actually getting to point B. So that's when they came up with the idea in World War I of the convoy system. So you get all these ships together at point A, load them up with the necessary supplies to get them to point B, and then have escorts, such as destroyers and destroyer escorts. And as we got into World War II, we found that it was even more effective if we could have planes in the air, because they could go out farther, see farther. They might even see the outline of a submarine down in the water. We didn't have much of that in World War II until much later, when we got the long-range B-24 bombers with extra fuel tanks in their bomb bays. Plus, the idea of the escort carrier. The escort carrier, they gave it the name because they needed those carriers, small carriers for the most part, out with the convoy, so they could have planes that they could launch, and they could go out even farther than the destroyers and destroyer escorts in an effort to locate some of these German wolf packs before they had a chance to do much damage to the convoys. But we're talking well into 1943, though, before we had the wherewithal to actually protect these convoys. So between 1939 and then after the United States got involved into 43, it took that long before we had enough ships and planes to make the convoy system more effective. And of course, the fact that Bletchley Park in England had cracked the German naval code, that helped a great deal II because Dönitz, who was the head of the German submarine service, was a micromanager. So he was always on the airways telling them to go here and go there. You need to be refueled. They had these big German submarines. They're called milk cows, where instead of having the U-boats come all the way back to France to refuel and rearm, they could be mid-Atlantic and be refueled and rearmed that way. The only problem was we knew when they were going to have these rendezvous, so then we could send ships and aircraft out there, and the Germans really started losing a lot of submarines after that. So let me talk a little bit about U.S. submarines, 1941 to 1945. Up at the top, you see the old S-boats. These were built right towards the end of World War I because, like I said, we were trying to stay out of World War I as best we could, but we eventually got dragged into it. So we weren't really, we hadn't turned over our manufacturing industry towards wartime use really until about 1917. So once we started building things for our entry into the war was already over. Matter of fact, a lot of the stuff that was being manufactured for U.S. forces never left the United States. A lot of U.S. forces in Europe were using French and British equipment. So even though we were building these between, let's say, 1918 and 1920, they really didn't see a lot of action the way the U-boats during World War II. They were kind of small. In the late 20s, they came up with the Argonaut-class submarine, much bigger. They had a couple of big guns. I'm not sure what size they were, 6 or 8-inch guns, I don't know. They built only 3 of them, and they proved not to be very effective as attack submarines because they were very slow to dive, hard to maneuver, easy to detect. They had a number of faults with them, but they kept them in service, and they used them for a variety of things during World War II. For example, they were big enough that they put U.S. Marine Corps raiders on the Nautilus, which is one of the Argonaut class, and they put them ashore in the northern Gilbert Islands, namely Macon and Butaritari. And the Marines went in there and stirred things up with the Japanese on those islands and then escaped back to the Nautilus and went back to Hawaii, except for a few who couldn't find their way back to the submarine, and they were later captured and executed by the Japanese. Nautilus was also used in the Solomon Islands because as the Japanese moved down to the Solomon Islands, there were a lot of planters and missionaries on those islands that couldn't get off. So they had to go bush. They had to go hide out in the jungle. And some of the Australian, I think it was either on Bougainville or Vella La Vella, maybe it was New Georgia, but there were a number of European planters and some missionaries from Orange County, California, who were hiding and they needed to be rescued. So the Australian Coast Watchers arranged for the Nautilus to meet off a beach at night, and there were signals made by flashlight. They were evacuated out to the Nautilus and then later transferred to a small U.S. Corvette and eventually made it out of there. Nautilus was later sunk, though, during the war. I'm not sure about Argonaut, and I think there was one other of this class, and I'm not sure how they ended up. But then we were still using the S-boats as we got into World War II. But even before Pearl Harbor, they were designing and building a new class of submarines. And this is an example of it. It's bigger than the S-boat, but smaller than the Argonaut class. These were a new type of attack submarines. And they were being improved on throughout the war because they would take some of these fleet boats out. And the skippers say, well, this works really well, but I think we could make some improvements here and move improvements there. So you had different classes of these fleet boats as the war progressed. Now, one of the people I interviewed was Edward Demure. He went into the Navy before Pearl Harbor. He was on the old cruiser Chester, and then at some point transferred to submarines, but they put him on one of these old S-boats that they still had. They had some in the Philippines, they had some at the submarine base at Pearl Harbor, and that's where he joined the submarine service aboard USS S-34. he said one of their first assignments after Pearl Harbor is, though, they sent them up to Dutch Harbor, up in Alaska, up in the Aleutians, where it's really cold. And they didn't have any heaters on these old S-boats. They actually had to go to Sears and Roebuck and buy some plug-in electric heaters so they wouldn't freeze to death when they got up to Alaskan waters. And at some point up there, while they were submerged, one of them started a fire in the submarine. So you can imagine how uncomfortable that was. But they went up to Alaska with a number of other S-boats, and these things were so old that he said in his oral history interview that on the way up there, one of them, their diving planes literally fell off. And so they couldn't use that anymore. So that was a very uncomfortable time for them for a number of reasons, but eventually he made his way back to the West Coast, and he was put on one of the new fleet boats. And he made a number of patrols throughout the Pacific during the war. And towards the end of the war, when our torpedoes started working the way they should have been, they started running out of targets, to the point that his submarine and some other submarines did the same thing, but they managed to thread their way through some minefields to get into the inland sea around Japan, because they thought once they got inside the inland sea, they might find some targets, because by late 44 into 45, we were running out of targets. But they got in there. I don't think they found much in there. And then while they were in there, the war ended. The Japanese surrendered, but they figured, well, we made it this far. I don't think we should try to thread our way back out through those minefields again. So they were stuck in there for at least a month until they could get some minesweepers in there and clear a path for them to finally get out. And USS Sea Lion, that was the first U.S. submarine sunk in World War II, but this was part of the Asiatic Fleet. Because Admiral Hart, as I had mentioned in a previous lecture, he was so sure that war with Japan would start at any time that he ordered his ships out of Chinese waters, at least most of them, down to the Philippines, where supposedly MacArthur's Air Force could provide air cover for them until MacArthur lost his Air Force in the opening days of the war. It was on December 10th, a couple of days after the bombing of Pearl Harbor, the Japanese bombed Cavite in Manila Bay, and that was where the big submarine base was for the Asiatic Fleet. If you ever take an aerial view of Cavite, it's just it's like a peninsula, and it was just jam-packed with warehouses and repair facilities and docking facilities. Now, most of the fleet had already fled to the Dutch East Indies, but there were a couple of ships there at Cavite, and one of them was the Sea Lion. It was undergoing repair or something, couldn't get away. And so when the Japanese bombed it, they hit the Sea Lion and sank it. Now, this is where I want to talk about torpedo problems, because we only had one torpedo shop in all of the United States going back to the early part of the century. That was in Rhode Island. And they were making, they had the old Whitehead torpedoes, and they were improving on them. But they were like making them one at a time. They weren't making a lot of them. And then after World War I, with the Navy budget cut way down, they didn't have a lot of money for experimentation or building them in mass. And now they had the old-fashioned kind, like the Mark VII, where they had the contact torpedoes that they used on the old S-boats. But they came up with the idea, too, of a magnetic exploder. This is all theoretical. It had never been proven. The idea was that you had an exploder that you set a certain depth to fire under the keel of the ship, and by all that iron in the ship, when the torpedo passed underneath it, it would cause a magnetic exploder to go off, breaking the keel of the ship and causing it to sink. It was all theoretical, but because of the limited funds being made available for this type of research, they never had a live fire testing of any of these magnetic exploders. It was all theoretical. And they also had, as they discovered later, they had problems with the depth settings. Like you might set the depth for 10 feet to go under the keel. They found out later that even though you set it for 10 feet, it was going maybe 10 or 15 or 20 feet deeper than the actual settings. And this problem was not corrected for almost 2 years after Pearl Harbor. The skippers were going out. They're taking chances with their lives and their submarines trying to get in close and sink ships, and they weren't. They were firing torpedoes that some of them, they would either go completely under the ship and out the other side, or they would explode prematurely before they got to the ship. And of course, that gave their position away to the Japanese. So they're really putting themselves at risk. And after a while, they started complaining to the Bureau of Ordnance, and the Bureau of Ordnance, well, they got on the defensive. They put their wagons in a circle, said it's not our fault, it's your fault. You don't know how to use the torpedoes. So this was going on, like I said, for almost 2 years, right up until September of 1943. Some of the submarine skippers were so convinced that the magnetic exploder was not working that they disconnected it without permission. That was supposedly a court-martial offense. And some of them, they reverted back to the contact exploders. What they discovered, I think, was that if you fired these newer torpedoes, the Mark 10, I think it was, if you fired at a 90-degree angle, and you hit the ship, it still wouldn't explode. They found accidentally, though, if you hit it at a slight angle, it might explode. It turns out there was something defective in the guides that guided the firing pin into the detonator. Some of these skippers were going back to the submarine base at Pearl Harbor, and they're going to the workshops, and they say, look, the magnetic exploder is useless. Even my contact exploders aren't working. I suspect the firing pins are not strong enough. And they were actually asking these people to make new firing pins for them. Finally, Admiral Lockwood decided that he was going to conduct some tests to see who was right and who was wrong. Was it the Bureau of Ordnance, the torpedo factory, or were the skippers doing something wrong? So they were concerned about the depth setting on the magnetic exploder. So I can't remember the name of the town, but it's on the south coast of Australia, around the corner from Fremantle. But there was a beach there that sloped up gradually. So what they did is they bought some fishing net and they hung it across the water, and then they fired torpedoes through the fishing net. Then they had scuba divers go down to see where they went through the fishing net. And that's where they discovered that the depth settings were all wrong. If you set it for 10 feet and it was going through the net at 20 feet, well, there is a problem there. As a result of that, Lockwood ordered a discontinuation of the magnetic exploders. Well, what about the contact exploders? It was one of the islands in Hawaii where there was a cliff face. Again, they bought a bunch of fish net, hung it up, and fired live torpedoes through the nets at the cliff. Now, a couple of the torpedoes actually exploded, but the ones they didn't, they took them apart and saw that the firing pins were bending. So this is now 2 years into the war. I mean, just think how different the war could have been if our torpedoes had started working. It might have prevented the Japanese from taking the Philippines, or it might have at least slowed down their progress, because we had submarines out there and we were firing torpedoes at them, at the Japanese ships in the Philippines, but we weren't doing any damage. So here we are, 2 years into it. And then there was a controversy of older versus younger skippers, or put another way, cautious versus aggressive skippers. It was felt a lot of these submarine skippers had been around for a while. Some of them were in their 40s, and they weren't seen to be sinking any ships, and they were being terribly cautious in the eyes of some of their superiors. And so they came up with the idea, maybe if we get younger guys in there who aren't afraid of taking a chance, who may be a little bit more innovative, maybe a little bit more creative, maybe they'll get more results. And as it turned out, that seemed to work out. And some of the older skippers actually asked to be relieved. I don't know if it had something to do with their age or whatever it was, but the stress of combat, the stress of trying to get in close to the enemy and sink ships and then failing really got to some of them. They were actually asked to be relieved. But by the end of 1942, 45 U.S. submarine skippers were replaced. And I don't have an answer to the question, but the question is, I wonder how many of them lost their command because of the torpedoes and not because of what they were doing or not doing. That's a question I've never been able to find an answer to. I have to mention Congressman Andrew May of Pennsylvania. In 1943, I think it was, he went on a fact-finding trip. It's called a junket. And one of the places they went to was a submarine base in Hawaii. While he was there, he was told that the U.S. submariners did not really worry about Japanese depth charges because they were set for only 50 feet, and our submarines can go much deeper than that. The Japanese didn't know that. But what did Congressman May do? He came home and had a press conference. And he says, guess what? I just got back from Hawaii, and Admiral Lockwood tells me that we don't have to worry about Japanese depth charges because they're only set for 50 feet, and our submarines can go much deeper. Well, sometime after that news conference, Admiral Lockwood wrote to Congressman May and says, thanks a lot, we just lost 10 submarines and 800 men. Now, there's no proof positive that what Congressman May said in his news conference had anything to do with it, but the suspicion was there. He did get reelected, but after the war, it was discovered, though, he was taking bribes from industrialists for nudging some military contracts that way, so he ended up going to jail. Don't worry, there's more like him in Congress now, so. But it's possible to be a politician and break the law and go to prison. I'll say no more. Anyway, I want to show you this map because we have the Asian mainland here. We have the Philippines, which was the biggest overseas base, U.S. base at the time. Japan is to the north of it. When President Roosevelt cut off petroleum exports to Japan, I might add that when the U.S. cut off petroleum exports to Japan, the Dutch and the British, who had oil fields in Borneo, did the same thing. Okay, so supposedly the Japanese only had about maybe a year to 18 months of reserves. What are they going to do when the reserves run out? They're going to have to throw their hands up, and they're going to have to bend to the will of President Roosevelt, who wanted them out of not only Indochina, but the Chinese mainland. So the attack in Pearl Harbor took place. Even before the attack in Pearl Harbor, ships from Japan were already on their way south because they wanted to seize the oil fields in British Borneo and the Dutch East Indies, mainly Sumatra. But as the war progressed and as American torpedoes started working properly, we had submarines all up and down the west coast of the Philippines, around Formosa, which is Taiwan today, and we were just picking off Japanese tankers right and left, to the point by the time we get into late 44, 45, they're practically out of petroleum products by then. So basically, our submarines are really dedicated to starving Japan into surrender. I'll go more into that in just a little bit. But we had submarine bases not only in Hawaii. We had them in Australia. We had them at Fremantle. Matter of fact, if you've ever been on a cruise where we dock at Fremantle, that's where the U.S. Submarine base was. And there was another one in Brisbane, and then we had, I think they moved another base out to Saipan after the Marianas were secured. And the USS Seawolf, SS-197, was the only submarine that was lost to friendly fire. There were other situations where submarines were almost sunk by friendly aircraft or ships, but during the war, they had, I guess, I don't know if they call free fire zones, or they had supposedly lanes in the ocean where submarines were free to return to base on the surface after finishing a patrol. And no plane or ship in the area was to attack any submarine in these sea lanes. The idea being that after a patrol, if you went back to your base on the surface, you get back there a lot faster. But for whatever reason, this destroyer escort, Rowell, was commanded by a reserve officer. Maybe he didn't get the word, but he fired on a U.S. submarine in one of these lanes. And they had a system for situations like that. If you're being bombed or targeted in any way, you could submerge and then fire off green flares. That was supposed to let the attacking plane or ship know that it was a friendly submarine. But for whatever reason, the skipper of the Royal ignored those flares and continued to drop depth charges on the Seawolf, and it was a loss with all hands. Now we're getting into the war, late 44, late 45. American torpedoes are working. We're sinking ships right and left. In fact, we're running out of targets. Here's another situation, USS Barb. The skipper is Commander Eugene Fluke. It looks like he's about 19 years old. Young skipper. But he managed, again, looking for targets, to get in close to into the inland sea around Japan looking for targets. Well, they weren't finding much to sink in there either. But his chief of the boat, Paul Sanders, made an observation. He told Commander Fluke, he says, Commander, have you noticed every night at the same time there's a train that goes by up here? What do you say we sink it? Okay, Fluke says, well, what do you have in mind? And he says, well, we can get some plastic explosive. We can go in there at night, and we can plant them on the trestle, this little bridge where the train goes. And if it's on time, like it always has been, we can set the explosive off for a certain time. And Fluke gave him the go-ahead. Sanders put the plan together. They went ashore in dinghies, planted explosives around the trestle, and sure enough, the train came by at the right time, the explosives went off, and that's how they sank a train. Now, submarines served other missions, too, in the war. Some of them were, of course, sinking enemy ships, war versus merchants. The Japanese seem to have the idea that if you're going to be a submariner and you've got probably the best torpedo in the world, you should use them to sink battleships and aircraft carriers and whatever. Merchant ships were, a lot of the merchant ships that were attacked, it seems like the Japanese didn't want to waste torpedoes, so they would surface and use their deck guns to sink them. But the U.S. thought ahead of time, if we can sink an aircraft carrier or a battleship, let's do it. But the idea is Japan is an island nation completely dependent for the importation of natural resources as well as foodstuffs. So the idea was to get rid of their merchant shipping so that they cannot bring back all the raw materials that they needed to continue the war. But they also conducted rescue operations, especially as when we started attacking some of the atolls in the Pacific and some of the high islands. Carrier pilots knew that if they got shot down, if they could bail out over the ocean or crash land the ocean, there would be American submarines in the area to rescue them. They also had what they call spyrons or spy squadrons because they had developed a way of taking photographs and even movie pictures through periscope of submarines. So prior to some landings, like in the Marianas or some of the other island landings during the war, prior to the Marines going in or the Army, they would send submarines around with just a periscope up, and they were taking photograph of the beaches where the Marines or Army might land to get an idea as to if there are any pillboxes or any structures of interest there prior to the landings. They were also used for laying mines. They laid mines around some of the ports along the Chinese mainland as well as around Japan. B-29s were also used for that. They would fly in low and lay mines in various waters that the Japanese occupied. And they also had special missions. I mentioned how the Nautilus was used to put Marine Corps raiders ashore in the Gilbert Islands, and how the Nautilus was used to rescue planters and missionaries out of one of the islands in the Solomons. U.S. submarines were also used to help the Australian Z Special Force. These were like commando units. U.S. submarines would put them on islands or maybe someplace in Papua New Guinea or in the Solomons where the Japanese had occupied it, and then they would go there either to get intelligence or maybe to stir up things with the Japanese. So they did have a variety of missions, not only sinking ships. And here's a photograph. The fellow in the dinghy is George H.W. Bush, future President of the United States. He was an Avenger fighter pilot. I think he's only 19 or 20 years old. I wouldn't even let my son drive the car when he was 19. But he was off a small carrier, the San Jacinto, I think, He was trying to knock out a radar site, I think, on one of the islands in the Bonin south of Japan when he got shot down. He had 2 crew members on the plane. They did not get out. He bailed out quite close to the island. And like I said, fortunately, there was an American submarine nearby, the USS Finback, and they rescued him. USS Tang, Dick O'Kane, another relatively young submarine skipper. He had a record for the most ships sunk and the most pilots rescued. He has something else to his credit. He sank his own submarine. Now, this was later in the war, much improvement in American torpedoes. We even had some new types of torpedoes, and they were licensed out to different companies. So it wasn't just one torpedo factory in Rhode Island making all of our torpedoes. We needed a lot of them, and we needed torpedoes that were effective. So General Motors also had a contract to build a certain type of torpedo. But this was in relative shallow water. It was at night because between the wars, they thought one of the best ways to use a submarine was to fire their torpedoes while submerged using their sonar to find the target. Well, that didn't work. The other thing was to, fire from periscope depth. That worked sometimes, but not always. But some of these young skippers say, well, let's just go in at night on the surface where we have a good view of the target and get as close as we can, then fire our torpedoes. And that's what they were doing at night. And they fired off a couple of torpedoes, but one of them was defective. It did a 360-degree turn, came around, and hit the submarine. Now, Captain O'Kane was on the bridge with a few people. They got off. There were some people in the forward part of the ship where the torpedo tubes were, and they had something called Mumsen lung. It's another submariner had vented this lung so that if you got in a situation like that, you could use it to go out through the torpedo tubes. And so the people in the forward part of the submarine actually used those Mumsen lungs effectively, but then they spent the rest of the war as POWs. The ones in the after part of the submarine, though, did not get out. I want to mention the Montevideo Maru and the USS Sturgeon. Montevideo Maru was a Japanese transport ship, and the Australians had a 1,400-man Lark force in Rabaul early in the war to defend Rabaul. That was on New Britain, Papua New Guinea. It was the biggest natural bay there. That we had airstrips there where we're concerned the Japanese might try to take it as they moved south, and that's what they did. So they only had 1,400-man team called Lark Force up there with very little in the way of weaponry, and the Japanese came in with 8,000 men. Now they took the place. They didn't take them long to take it. A lot of the Australians went into the bush. Some of them actually made it back to Port Moresby and eventually Australia. Some of them surrendered further down the coast at a place called Toll Plantation, thinking, okay, now we'll be POWs, but instead the Japanese took them out one by one and executed them. There were others, though, who surrendered in Rabaul along with a number of civilians. Over 1,000 of them were put on the Montevideo Maru, and they were being supposedly sent to Hainan Island, just off the Asian mainland north of Luzon. But before they got there, the U.S. submarine Sturgeon, not knowing that all these Australians were there, hit it with a torpedo. It sank quite rapidly. Most of the Japanese got off, but none of the Australians did because they had been locked in the hold. It was only a year or so ago that they found the Montevideo Maru, so they know exactly where it is. But the remains of the Australians there will be left there because situations like that are considered war graves. Hell ships. There were quite a few Allied POWs from Singapore, the Philippines, and other places. But as the war turned against the Japanese, what they tried to do is remove a lot of those POWs that were in the Philippines and other places. They put them on ships and sent them back to Japan to use as slave labor, except they didn't exactly stencil on the side of the ship that there were POWs aboard. So U.S. submarines didn't know that. So we sank a number of these ships, and literally thousands of Allied POWs were killed as a result of this. I had a neighbor when I was a kid growing up. He was on the Bataan Death March, survived that, and he survived the sinking of several of these hell ships. Japanese submarines. Now, what if they had employed their subs the same way the Germans had employed theirs? Because the Japanese or the German wolf packs were so effective that we had to use the convoy system, and we had to find ships and airplanes to protect those convoys as they went back and forth across the Atlantic. But you know what? The Japanese, even though they had very good submarines and probably the best torpedo in World War II, they did not use their submarines the same way the Germans did. So it became evident early on that we would not need to use the convoy system in the Pacific. We could send ships out one at a time or in small groups, and we would not have to find destroyers, destroyer escorts, and aircraft that we didn't really have in the early part of the war to escort these fleets. So basically, the war fought in the Pacific was much different than the war that was fought in the Atlantic, simply because the Japanese did not use their submarines as effectively as the Germans used their U-boats. And the three things that the Japanese didn't have: radar, for one thing. They had some. They were working on a radar early, but it wasn't very effective, and they hadn't progressed to the point where they could use it as effectively as the U.S. And actually, the U.S. was just starting to use radar in the early part of the war, too. Matter of fact, most of our ships during the early days of the fighting in the Solomon Islands did not have radar. There's only one or two ships that did. And there was only a few officers who knew how to use radar. There were only a few enlisted personnel who were trained to use it and repair it. But as the war progressed, more and more Allied ships were using radar, and we were training people how to use it. I even read that Admiral Halsey, when he was first introduced to radar in the Solomon Islands, he didn't even know anything about it. When he was told, well, this is radar, and this is how we're going to use it, and he says, radar, yes, I've heard of that. So it was, but we did use it much more effectively as the war progressed than the Japanese. Plus, we had intelligence. We had the code breakers. We knew exactly what the Japanese Navy was planning and where they were going to be, and that was really effective in sinking ships and actually bringing the war to a close probably sooner than possible. Oh, and we made maximum use of subs for sinking ships, because as the war turned against the Japanese, they were actually taking submarines out of war patrols to resupply, for example, their troops on Guadalcanal. They were using submarines to take in supplies and reinforcements. And when you're using your submarines like that more and more as the war turns against you, then you have fewer submarines to go out and cause damage to Allied shipping. This is the Japanese ship I-124 in the early days of World War II. It was used to lay mines in the waters off Darwin in northwestern Australia. It was discovered doing this by a couple of Australian corvettes. They located it and sank it with depth charges. I think it's about 200 meters of water, if I remember correctly, and some divers did find it recently. The Japanese also had the biggest submarine in the world. This is the I-400 series. The idea was to build dozens of these. These things could carry enough fuel to sail around the world 1.5 times. Not only that, this was a submersible aircraft carrier. They had hangars on the deck and held 2 airplanes. They could wheel them out and put the wings and the struts on in a matter of minutes, and then they could catapult them off the bow of the ship. They were going to build dozens of these, but a lot of the construction was interrupted by the bombing of Japan. There was one I-400 that was going to go out on its first war patrol, and it hit a mine before it even got out of the inland sea. They managed to actually get one out of the Japanese waters and send it on patrol, but before it could do any damage, the war ended. And they were ordered to surrender to the nearest Allied ship, which they did. The Americans, and they took it back to Pearl Harbor and studied it. Took it apart and were really amazed at the technology. But then the Russians found out we had it, and they wanted to see it too. So they took it off the coast of Pearl Harbor and sank it. It's still sitting out there someplace. And these are K-10 carriers. Some of the submarines, what you're seeing on there, it may look like well, they are torpedoes, but they have a cockpit. You've heard of kamikazes? Well, this is a kamikaze torpedo. And they actually had a cockpit, and they put a guy in there, and they launched him, and it was a one-way trip. I think they ended up killing more Japanese than they did Allies. There was a tanker in one of the atolls, can't remember the name of it, but they actually had a K-10 get in there and sink a U.S. oiler that was in there. I have to talk a little bit about W.H. Holmes. He was a submariner, a graduate of the Naval Academy, but he was medically discharged either in the late 20s or early 30s because he had arthritis of the spine. He had it so bad he just couldn't do his job. So he was medically retired, but he stayed in Hawaii. He taught at the University of Hawaii, and he wrote stories with a naval theme for magazines such as Saturday Evening Post. But well before Pearl Harbor, in spite of his medical disability, he was called back to active duty. He wasn't put on submarines. He was sent over to work for Commander Rochefort and the Code Breakers. And he wasn't even sure what his job was going to be. But as it turned out, what he did do was when Code Breakers found information about Japanese ship movements, he would then take that information over to Admiral Lockwood at the sub base. And he says, if you send some submarines over here to these coordinates, you might find something to sink. And so over half of the Japanese ships sunk during the war were sunk by American submarines. And a lot of that had to do with the fact that we were reading their mail. Now, after the war, I have to add this caveat to it. Because sometime during the war, a young doctor had come out there, and he was a rheumatologist. And we brought out something that was new. It was called penicillin. So this doctor gave Holmes a shot of penicillin, and guess what? His arthritis disappeared. So if you're in the medical profession, it suggests to me he didn't have arthritis. He had osteomyelitis, which is a bone infection. I mean, it was so bad he had to wear these metal braces just to get around. But after he got the penicillin, he was a new man. Okay. But I have to tell you something else about this guy. And it's anecdotal, so I can't prove it, and I've tried to research it. But after the war, he wrote his biography about what it was like to work for Commander Rochefort and the Code Breakers and what they had accomplished. And it was afterwards at a cocktail party or something. There was a bunch of ex-submariners, and there was an ex-German U-boat commander there. And they started talking. And the U-boat commander said, we had terrible problems with our torpedoes the first 2 years of the war. We were experimenting with these magnetic exploders. They didn't work. Our contact exploders wouldn't work. 2 years before we could figure out what the problem was. And Holmes said, wow, we had those exact same problems. And he says, I know, we had spies in your torpedo factory. Like I said, it's anecdotal. I can't prove it. I've even tried. I've looked around. Maybe someday I'll find absolute proof. So, like I said, it's anecdotal. I can't prove it. So, I'm just getting ready to wrap it up. I have 1 minute left. Okay, so about 50,000 individuals in the U.S. submarine service during the war. 16,000 made war patrols, and 3,500 of them were lost. How many of those were due to the news conference that Congressman May held? I can't say. But that was a 22% loss for all of those who made war patrols. I think was it 55 submarines we lost all total, I think. I can't remember. I think that's about what it is. But the Germans, because we were reading their mail too, and we had enough escorts and aircraft to track them down, and Admiral Donitz of the submarine service was telling us where submarines were. Well, they lost almost 800 U-boats. Admiral Donitz lost one of his sons, who was a U-boat commander too, as a result of that. So of the 40,000 men who made patrols, almost 30,000 of them were killed. The Japanese lost 130 submarines. So I don't know how many they had in total, and I've never come up with a figure of how many Japanese submariners were lost. But here's some post-war conclusions. Subs were cost-effective. I mean, there weren't not much of the budget was put into submarines. but the results of their actions was quite impressive. Some people think that some island invasions could have been not made. Maybe firebombing was not needed. Because basically what the submarine was accomplishing and could have accomplished without the atomic bomb is we could literally have starved the Japanese into surrender. Because they were on rations even before Pearl Harbor. They could not feed themselves, and they certainly had nothing in the way of natural resources, maybe a little bit of coal, and that's about it. But the one argument, I think, against starving the Japanese into surrender is the fact that there were approximately 60,000 Allied prisoners of war in the Japanese home islands at the time. So if we were going to starve them into surrender, most of those POWs probably would not have survived the war. So important stuff. The submarine force made up 2% of the U.S. Navy. U.S. subs sank 55% of Japanese shipping, and the main target was merchant ships. This graph gives you an idea as to how effective the submarine force was in World War II, because if you look at that graph on the far left, the upper shaded part, that was the number of Japanese merchant ships that were sunk by submarines. And then the darker shade down toward the bottoms were naval losses, submarine or aircraft carriers, battleships, whatever. And then these are the number of merchant ships and naval losses by carrier aircraft and so on down the line. So I think considering how much we invested in submarines during World War II and the number of shipping that they sank, I thought they were pretty cost effective. And this is what Admiral Halsey said at the end of the war: if I had to give credit to the instruments and machines that won the war in the Pacific, I would rank them in this order: submarines first, radars second, planes third. Funny he didn't mention the code breakers. Tomorrow I'll be talking about aircraft carriers in the Pacific War.